Hello.
Hey, Ryan, David.
What's up, man?
Okay, great. Have you recorded? I'm going to dive right into it. First, I wanted to welcome the fans back to our second podcast. In this podcast, I have Ryan back. We're going to be discussing really what is considered the first week of the indoor season. I know that the season started in December, but January is when things really get going. We had a few interesting performances that I wanted to discuss with Ryan. I know many of you all had seen the Times or not everybody kind of got things going because, college kids are coming back from Christmas vacation or holiday vacation, and things really take a swing for a strong point next week. But this week there were some notable performances, but also some performances that were notable not for the positive, but for the negative. We're in the first topic, and we briefly touched on this in our conversation that I wanted to talk about was, we're coming back again from holiday vacation. Some of them have rust, but what if they're a defending champion and you're expecting them, regardless of when they come back, for them to dive right in? Let's, look at Keandre Bates of Florida. He's a defending champion in long jump. He has a PR indoors of 26 feet, 4.5. And at the Clemson Invitational Orange and Purple Classic, he was fourth in jumping, in the high 24s. Should we be alarmed at that performance, or is that performance typical of someone who was probably home, not necessarily eating the best during the holiday season?
Well, I would, say when we're looking at certain events, there are events that are finicky, and there are events that, if you're prepared and you're sharp and you're ready to go, the fluke bad performance or the fluke good performance is less likely. I actually just got done presenting at the Kansas State Coaches Clinic Saturday, and one of the things we talk about all the time is, like, if a distance kid, runs a really good performance, anything, above, 800 and above, and they come back to you like, well, that was a fluke. I really can't do that. It's like, no, there's so much required to go right for you to run that performance, to do that it isn't a fluke. You are absolutely 100% capable of doing that. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, in a jump event or a throw event, there's so many factors that could play a role in a performance being seen like as an outlier, kind of like, man, where did that come from, versus a performance where maybe, it was a little bit of a disappointment. Obviously, if you're the national champ, you want to come out firing on all cylinders. But in reality, depending on where he goes home for winter break and training, the weather has been so terrible on the East Coast. When you have 2 or 3 inches of ice, you're not going outside, you're not traveling, you're not going to be, meet or race sharp. And in the jumps, that's like the most finicky and fickle event there is. It's such a difficult event. I mean, when you're looking at this tiny, tiny little white board that you have to steer your way to down a runway and to hit it perfectly, to then be able to put everything together when you're in the air for the jump, that's really tough. So I would think, obviously that's one of the reasons why we give jumpers, anywhere from 6 to 8 jumps in a meet, if they make the finals and however they want to format the competition. So, I mean, obviously with that many attempts, there may be a little bit of questioning, but sometimes it's hard to steer the board. One of my athletes that I had at my high school, her name's Tasha Frazier. You can look her up. I think she was junior college national champion while she was in junior college, and then at Iowa State in her first year, she didn't jump very well, but her hurdles improved a lot. Well, why is that? Well, hurdles are obviously a technical event. A lot of things can go wrong, but you can also power through those and kind of, what I would say, roughhouse those events and still get to a good performance where, if you can't find the board as a jumper, that could be an ongoing, battle, and sometimes that can be difficult to handle. So I would assume with him, there's some element of concern, maybe not from the ultimate jump, but just let's get ourselves back on the board. Let's go back to the basics. Let's work on the approach. Let's work on our runway. And, the University of Florida is pretty darn good with the jumps. So I imagine that he'll be just fine. But, the jump event is they're so finicky and they're so fickle, and it's just one of those things that as jumpers, I think everyone has experienced from time to time. We had a young lady at my high school who was our top triple jumper and probably the better of the two girls we had that made it to state that year. And she was afraid to go push the board back, and to jump from the farther and farther back board so she could stretch out the triple jump in her phases to make a big jump. And sure enough, at the state championship, she jumps off the wrong board, which was 5 feet farther back than the board she told them she was going to jump from, and makes it into the pit. And I'm going crazy because I'm like, that's the biggest jump I've ever seen. And then quickly realized that she told them the board in front of that. So instead of jumping 37.6, it was a 32.5 jump because it was a 5-foot separation on the board. So the kid's super capable of jumping this massive PR. But then after that, the whole competition was pretty much lost because she's like, well, I just screwed up. I just lost the opportunity to jump a personal best. And I'm like, no, you didn't. You just did it. How could you lose it after you just did it? And sometimes mentally, dealing with the athlete on the runway is really difficult task, especially when some other people might be doing big performances in front of them. And the Clemson meet, as we look at these top 20 results, seems to be the Clemson Purple Invitational. Looks like it was one of the best ones so far this season. So
yes, it was. For it to be so early, there was certainly some notable times. And talking on the opposite spectrum, like we had some really good performances early, and even like at the dual meet between Tennessee and Indiana, you had a guy, Mustakeem Williams. He was a big-time recruit coming out of high school. He was kind of quieted after high school, had to sit behind Christian Coleman, and now he seems to be picking up where Christian kind of left off. I mean, under 21 seconds in the 200 already, 20.99 on Indiana's bank track, which is, not a super bank, but it's still a bank track. That time is notable. Are we saying, okay, wait, is he peaking too early, or are we just simply saying, wait a minute, because of his history, this may be his breakout year?
That's an interesting point. So, like, Vince Anderson talked a lot about when we've heard him present on a number of different things, their philosophy at Texas A&M is, we want to sprint fast right away. We're not going to wait to peak. If you wait to peak, you never peak. And in the sprint world, if you see a hot time and a hot performance, you can pretty much expect that time and then that performance is going to be pretty close to standard at the end of the year for that athlete, and they'll be able to stabilize that performance. And it's really interesting, like the athletes that tend to be in the top 20 after the first month of indoors tend to be the same athletes in the top 20 towards the conference championships and then obviously the indoor national championships. Those athletes they may shift a couple spots, but you don't see a lot of kids come out and drop a whole bunch of time. And I mean, that makes sense. I mean, these kids have been training since September. So if they're ready, they're prepared. If they've made, months of positive decisions and the coaches have kept them healthy, you should expect that performance should be around towards the end of the season. Now, that's with one caveat. As you and I both know, indoor track is really funky because if you get a poor lane assignment at conference or at the national championships, that could completely dictate your 200-meter performance. And depending on the track itself, if you're running at Arkansas, you're going to get a very different performance in the 200 meters than you would if you were at Boston at the, the Reggie Lewis Center. So just the way that those tracks are constructed is going to be very different. And a lot of universities have moved towards not going on a 200-meter track, but building, oversized tracks that look a lot more like, what we would expect outside, but have a roof over it, which is great for training and great for performances, but it really makes the indoor times very difficult to compare because of the facility to facility. It's almost like golf.
Right.
It's like what a par 3 might be on, one course could be completely different on another course from location to location. So I think of the sprint, especially anything where you have to use that bank, really is dictated by facility.
Okay. Well, there were two sprint performances on the women's side that really stood out to me. One, it's going back to the Clemson meet, was the young Leanna Irby of Georgia. When she signed to Georgia, personally, I was like, Georgia really hasn't had a great sprinter there since Debbie Ferguson. And how long she was a long-time sprinter. Now she's coaching. And here's this really talented girl running 51 seconds in the 400 as a junior, and you're thinking probably Texas, maybe USC, and then she goes to Georgia. And then she kind of answers any concerns that you may have had with her 300-meter performance. She beats Kyra Jefferson by more than a second in the 300, running 36.73. That's one of the fastest times ever ran in the 300, close to what Cindy McLaughlin of Kentucky has ran. So what do you make of her time, fresh off, again, the holiday season, and beating someone who's now professionally signed to Nike by a second?
Well, sometimes first of all, it's an amazing performance, and I do not want to diminish that performance at all. I mean, wow. Just absolutely wow is one of the things that just come to my head when I say that. But we always want to be a little bit hesitant with the comparison and beating the pros. Sometimes the pros came off a long, summer season or whatever, and they're using these races more as a time trial than it is, kind of, hey, this is going to be my best performance of the year. In fact, you notice a lot of the pros tend to wait to open up their season. However, anytime you can get a scalp from a pro, you're in a pretty good, you're doing something really great. And, now we talked about earlier how some of these performances don't drop as much. What I would say, though, is that in the 400, those times tend to come down quite a bit, and you could see, big improvements coming from those speed endurance events as those athletes continue to get more and more race ready and race sharp. The other thing, though, that kind of plays a role, too, is that, for those of us that are kind of newbies to college track, the 400 eventually finishes with everybody in lane one. And so getting that position and jockeying for that position and managing those races sometimes isn't even about who's the most fit, but who comes into the race with the best strategy. There's a heck of a lot of gamesmanship that can be done when they're jockeying for those positions and breaking towards the inside. So when you could beat a pro who might be somebody with a lot of college experience or seasoned in how to handle those events, sometimes that's a pretty impressive thing. So if she's running that fast now, when you look towards the end of the year in a speed endurance event, you're going to see quite a bit of a drop. And that's pretty exciting because there's been some very, very fast women running in the United States at the collegiate level for a while. So opening up with a time like that is very promising.
I agree. Now, this past weekend, was there any performance that, outside of that one, because we both went wow, was there a performance that stood out to you that made you go, yeah, you're a real threat to win the national title in this specific event?
It's interesting because when you look at some of these events and you look at some of I would actually go back to, even a little farther back than this weekend, if you don't mind, but I like looking at the Boston University season opener for the 5,000 meters. And I know that, we're going from sprints all the way up to the 5,000, but when you look at Carissa Schweizer from Mizzou, and maybe I'm a homer because I'm from Mizzou, but she's running a 15:17. Well, the collegiate record is held by one of my former athletes from Parkway Central, Emily Sisson. And so when I'm seeing a girl that's running just 5 seconds slower than what Emily ran as the national record her senior year, that just really is a surprising performance. Now, oftentimes the distance coach's strategy is we come off cross country, we hold our fitness for a week or two, we go to Boston, because again, that track is a distance-friendly facility. It's flat, it's not banked. It's got a lot of, obviously tradition and stuff too up there in terms of what they're trying to get done. And, you look at, there's 6 of the top, there's all but one of the top 10 performances came out of that meet. So those are wows. And then what will be interesting is typically what happens is then those coaches will pull away from the speed and go back to the drawing board and kind of rebuild, hoping that 5,000 meter performance will hold on as a standard till the end of the season. And I mean, obviously somebody who's 5 seconds off the NCAA record is probably going to be a shoo-in for the national championship. So it'll be interesting to see what those young ladies are able to do as they reload. They go back to maybe a base building phase of their training, and to see if they can go after that NCAA record. And obviously, I don't want to see a kid that I used to coach have their record taken from them. But if it's going to be anybody, it might as well be a kid from my home state that represents our flagship university. So I'll be tracking that story for sure as the winter season goes along.
Right, because she, right off the gate, I mean, coming off, a good cross-country season, early on, you're expecting to put on a good, solid time. But that made your eyes go, wait, what?
Right. Well, and especially when you think, her national championships in cross-country, she would have what I would assist. I mean, hey, if I finished 11th in the United States in the NCAAs, I'd have been ecstatic. But for somebody who's been, a multi-time national championship, she kind of probably felt a little bit bummed about how that played out in cross country. And nobody's perfect. I mean, very few people can win, every race, even Cheserett or whatever. But, you look at this time and it's kind of like, hey, blood in the water. I want to prove, I'm still the main honcho when it comes to, long distance running in the United States at the collegiate level. And she certainly had something to prove that day and made it happen. So it was awesome.
I agree. And, sticking with big time performances, from the weekend, another performance that stood out to me and going back down to the sprints, Aaliyah Hobbs, last year she ran the 10.85 outdoors. It is the second fastest time in NCAA history. Her first 60 meters last season were never really that great, but she was really good. In this situation, she begins the season with a 7.24, and she ran on the prelim. And I looked at the video because LSU has a video. If you ever want to see it, it's on their Twitter page, or just visit lsusports.net. Where you see her prelim, she really doesn't push it to the line. So it's fair to say she probably could have went under 7.2 in her first meet. I know that the Oregon girls, Hannah Cunliffe and Ariana Washington, are going to be there. But are we ignoring Aaliyah Hobbs by focusing too much on them, especially after what we just saw and what LSU was known for?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, LSU usually dominates indoors, especially. I mean, there are so many of their young ladies that run extraordinarily fast. So I would hope, as a track fan, nobody ever doubts LSU. It's kind of one of those things, what was his nature boy Ric Flair said, you want to be the man, you got to beat the man, and so LSU has been one of those programs where, traditionally they're the top flight sprint program in the United States, right up there, obviously on the men's side of Texas A&M, and Oregon obviously has done some just outrageously incredible things over the last couple of years. So, you've got Hannah Cunliffe out there as one of the favorites, obviously being the returning national indoor 60-meter champion. But, when you are that top person, you've always kind of got that target on your back, and it's a challenge, and people are trying to gun for you. And sometimes nowadays, too, with the with the advent of the internet and everybody can see everybody's performances and how they race, like seeing that Hobbs is gearing down and still running that time in a 60-meter dash is probably pretty intimidating for those athletes that don't necessarily have the kind of confidence that they need to have to race at the championship level. There is a little bit of kind of like a gamesmanship that comes with that, in terms of, I can still run this time and gear down and still qualify. Now, obviously, in the 60-meter dash, you can't do too much of that, because if you do, you're going to end up getting caught by somebody. But for now, I mean, LSU's got, 3 of the top 5 women in the 60-meter dash nationally as of now as we're talking. So, I mean, it's good stuff.
Already in dominance mode, LSU. It never fails. Like this group, like last year's group was so impressive. The amount of sprinters they had. I mean, they had 5 in the finals of the SEC. Let's remember what type of conference that is.
Right. Right.
Majority of those girls have come back, or women have come back, and she's one of the standouts. And when I saw the video, I couldn't believe. I said, she's not pushing it at 7.24. She gets to about the 50 meter. I really thought she could run 7.15, 7.16. I'm like, already? It's January, and she's
right.
already 7.1. Wow.
Well, and what's scary is to think, again, when you do get outdoors and you get to run in these warm conditions, and if you get to run at up in Oregon on that track, that's just like, that's almost like a juiced track. Those times that come off of that facility is just outrageous. And so it'll be really interesting to see, the progression that they're able to hit. But obviously, it bodes really well for them. You having 3 in the top 5 in the nation, and as we talked about before, that's a good spot to start, because that means by the end of the year, as long as these ladies can stay healthy, it could mean some really cool stuff. Now, one of the things I did want to also highlight, besides the trio of LSU Tigers, is Katie Hall. So Katie Hall, it was more known kind of for her long jumping prowess, but, she's now a junior. She was originally at Iowa State and then transferred to Georgia and had a very, very good season at Georgia, but she was the national record holder in high school in the long jump, and she's also pretty fast. So her being 3rd nationally at this point right now, again, bodes really well, not just because, hey, this is a competitive 60-meter dash athlete, but also what is she going to be able to do as the season progresses in the long jump, now with that, what looks to be a resurgence in her sprint speed.
Yeah, she's under good coaching there at Georgia. I don't think the situation worked out well for her at Iowa State. I'm with you. Her freshman year was a little down for her because she was such a good sprint jumper. There weren't that many for a while. Now it seems to be coming back. You had Jennifer Ndini, and now you have her, where she's a legit threat to do well in the long jump. She's defending champion, and she began that well too, 21.9 the first meet, beating Katura Urgi, her teammate. And also keep in mind, Georgia had three women go over 21 feet in their first meet, and they still have other jumpers. So
yeah, oh, absolutely. Well, and in fairness to the situation at the other university, sometimes just things don't fit well. Sometimes coaches, like we talked about last time you and I discussed on the podcast, sometimes it's just not a good fit. It doesn't even have anything to do with the success of the program or the philosophy of the coaches. Sometimes just athletes do better. We had in our summer track club, we had 3 young ladies who went down to LSU, and here we just got done talking about how fantastic LSU was. And all 3 of those ladies that were from our summer track club eventually finished their college career in other places. And all of them, or 2 of the 3 ran really well once they left there. And obviously LSU has consistently continued to produce great performances. So sometimes it's just a matter of location and feeling comfortable or getting along with a particular type of coach, and that coach-athlete relationship is a symbiotic one. So, sometimes it doesn't flow well, and for whatever reasons, and a fresh pair of eyes and greener pastures sometimes helps, and in this situation, it looks pretty good. And, again, just like LSU has those really top flight sprinters, think about how practice would be every day if you're a sprinter at LSU or a jumper at Georgia. Just think about the competitive nature that goes on with those athletes in between practices. It's got to be pretty darn intense. And on top of that, vicariously, hopefully, you get to learn by watching your teammates like, hey, never kind of seen that before, and that seemed to be really working for them. Maybe that's something that I can experiment with on my approach or my penultimate step, or how I configure my block and the block start. And by being in that environment, the best teams I've ever had as a high school coach had nothing to do with me necessarily. It had all to do with the collective of athletes and their own culture. I talk about this all the time. As a coach, I can make you good, but you decide whether or not you're going to be great. And so if you're in an environment with 3 jumpers that are 1, 2, and 3 in the United States, or you've got 3 or 4 girls in the 60-meter dash, that's always going to help things be better, because you've got that inner competition every day at practice. You don't have to go travel 1,000 miles away from your university. It's right there when you wake up in the morning and walk into the gym. You know, so that's pretty cool.
Right, and those environments really do that's what really helps attract those big time recruits. Is am I going to develop well here? And I wanted to touch base on some of the freshmen, or just some of the things that I've seen recently with a lot of the top tier programs. I've seen more of the athletes running in the non-traditional races. Instead of running an 800, they'll run 1,000. Instead of running the 400, they may run a 5 or 600. What does an athlete with a good time in those events do with that when they go to their main event? Is there any way we could use a performance in the 600 to guess a time for the 400, or a performance in the 1,000 to guess a time for the 800? Or is that something we would just simply say, if they run a good time, that means great, they're in great condition for their main event?
Well, I would say, the answer to that question is both. I think that you can do some comparing and contrasting to what you think it could correlate to in an event above or below. Philosophically at my school with our 800 runners, and, I know I wrote this big old book on sprinting, but, what's kind of funny is researching your own program and you look at, well, where have we really been truly the most successful? Well, truly, we've been the most successful actually at the 800, which is probably one of the reasons why I kept the 800 in the Sprinters Compendium as an event, because I believe it's a long sprint. But if you think about that event right there, because that's usually where the funny races take place, right? You don't usually have like a 100-meter long jumper go up and run the 400 too often in college, unless they have that kind of range and you're going to throw them on a 4x4 outdoors, or at the college's conference championship indoors. But you look at those events, kind of the goofy ones being more for the long sprinter. That's kind of the way I like to call them, as opposed to mid-distance. Anytime a sprinter hears distance, you really find out how good their 400 is. So they run away from you. But I do think that those events correlate. So one of the things that we do in training is we will train for an 800 specialist. 1 week they'll train below the event. So they'll train more as a 400-meter runner. And then the next week they'll train as a miler. So Monday, week 1, they have a speed workout for 400-meter centric training. And Monday of week 2, they'll have a distance runner, a miler type of workout. Now, the volumes which they train are obviously not going to be nearly as large on the distance side of things. And then the speed, probably the percentages of speed effort might be a little bit slower if they're truly an 800-meter specialist. But in the indoor track, I think what it does is it gives the athletes an opportunity to play with that a little bit, but also it gives the coach a chance to get a competition underneath their belt, and if they feel like the athlete, they want to try to move them up. So if they're an 800-meter runner that you're trying to move up to the 15, the 1,000-meter allows you a conversation piece to say, hey, I really think you could do something special here. And if you're running a 500 or something else, like, hey, as a 400-meter runner, hey, we might be able to move you up to the 8, or an 800-meter runner, we might be able to move you down to 4, or more importantly, if you're a 400-meter hurdler, you don't have a race. So the best thing to simulate, what you feel in a 400-meter hurdle might be that 600 or that 500 meters, depending on the format of the meet. So coaches use that as a test of similar stress to kind of figure out what's going on. Now, another way you could look at this is if an athlete is like in terrible shape, and you're kind of worried about their first performance, and you just kind of want to rip off the Band-Aid and get a track meet over with just to kind of see where they're at. Running that odd event doesn't allow for that athlete to really know exactly where they're at as much as the coach knows where they're at. And so that gives you a little bit of time in which you need to adjust some things in training, or it gives you some time to reinforce what you've been telling that athlete, like, hey, we really got to take care of, the 22 hours you're away from me at practice. You're not sleeping, you're not eating well, you're not taking care of your body. These are things that we need to take care of. But at the same time, not be so severe that it destroys the athlete's confidence completely. Because in track and field, that aspect of confidence cannot be oversold. It is a huge factor on how well that athlete's going to perform.
Agreed. I really do. Now, so we take that and we store it and we recognize early season. There's still some conditioning. However, this is, in college, it's a team sport. It's a collection of individual performances, towards getting a championship. Was there a team this past weekend on the men's or women's side or both where that stood out to you and says, you know what, this team really is deserving of a number one ranking and they're ready to be the indoor national champions?
It's really hard for me to ignore Georgia. Just knowing what they have and the really high-end class of coaches that they have and the different athletes that they have in all of these different events, and then you think about the multi-event athletes that'll be coming online here shortly. They can't do that indoor pentathlon many times in a row, but it's something that they always kind of have in their hip pocket. They're an interesting group, on the women's side, and obviously Oregon will have something to say about that and some other schools, but it's one of those things where I look at them and I'm just like, they just seem to have too much and diversity, not necessarily racial diversity or anything like that, but the diversity of the events in which they can cover, it's like it gives you a wide margin of error, if that makes any sense. Because let's say something goes wrong in training or you have a series of bad weather or, one athlete ends up getting an injury, because you have all of these different events that you're relatively strong in, it just increases the chance of something really good also happening to cover the bad, so you don't have to put all of your eggs, in one basket. And, on the men's side, again, you're constantly looking at, the University of Tennessee a little bit maybe, because of the two guys in the 200, that could potentially in a national championship situation be a lot of points, that could really help them out. And, that's something that I think you've always got to focus on, because if they're that good in the 2, they probably can move up and run the 4 for you, or they possibly could run, down and run the 60. So those are a lot of points that are probably set up there. And, after Mr. Coleman left, to have those two guys be 1-2 right off the bat,
right
behind him is awfully impressive, for sure.
What do you think about Florida this weekend? Granted, they were shaking off rust. They had a really good recruiting class where they replaced a lot of their missing pieces that they didn't have for a championship run last year. They've added, to me, more depth in the sprints. They've added more depth in their jumping events, and they have new coaching for the distance. And they're throwing always just they never seem to not have a good thrower. Every year there's always one, but this year they have a group. What do you think about them? Is it too early to crown them as the number one for this season, or are you sure that Tennessee is the team that you want to give the early number one to?
Well, again, if you want to beat the man, you got to beat the man. And Florida under Mike Holloway, he's a Hall of Famer. He's one of the greatest track coaches, in the history of the United States, especially at the collegiate level. He has few rivals, and so you can never doubt that, they're going to be able to put some things together. You do return the national champ in the long jump. You return some people. And again, it goes back to that diversity. You look at the 60-meter hurdles, you've got two people in the top 10 in the 60-meter hurdles that are running really well to start out the season. Florida always has a good 4x4. Those things are truths that are undeniable. So yeah, they're going to be in the mix, and especially because when you're talking about freshmen, if they're as good as they were when they were in high school and they're happy and they're in a good spot, plan on them really hopefully making a big push towards the end of the indoor season. sometimes outdoor, those freshmen can get burnt out because they just have never gone that long training and at that intense workload. But indoors, if those freshmen are really that legit, you could see at the end of indoors they're really going to have a strong peak and do something special, more so than you would see from some of the upperclassmen, because they're kind of already have done it and you kind of know what they are, and their bodies have seen that and experienced that before. But, a strong freshman recruiting class can always help a team towards the end of indoor.
Agreed. Now, they lost last year's indoor meet by a half point to Texas A&M. Texas A&M lost a really big piece, and, Curley, he's gone. His brother's there. They had a great debut in December running the 307 the 4x4. But do you think they have enough to compete with Florida?
Well, I mean, so that's kind of the thing, right? When you look at like the Cold War, right? The world was kind of a bipolar place. It had the Soviet Union and the United States. Well, in the war, in the Cold War of track and field, Texas A&M and Florida are constantly kind of like volleying back and forth with the championships. And I mean, Texas A&M has great facilities. They have ideal winter weather. You do have the other Curly brother who is fast too. So they'll be in the mix for sure. And again, Vince Anderson is probably him and Curtis Taylor are arguably the two best assistant coaches in the United States and probably on planet Earth. So they always get it done and do some pretty special things. So they'll be a part of the conversation as we get a few more meets under the belt. And what'll be really exciting is at the SEC championships, we'll get to see kind of where both programs are at, and it's, as we mentioned in the last podcast, the SEC championship is basically like especially indoors is even higher up the rankings than the outdoors. Outdoors you have some more major competitions, but it's one of the top 5 meets every year. So when that SEC championship is done and the dust settles, we'll have a much clearer picture on who are the mover and shakers in the United States when it comes to NCAA track.
Agreed. That meet just, and Mike Holloway mentioned it on one of his interviews a couple of years ago, and he constantly reiterated it. Said it's a world championship in itself. It is so competitive. You have so many different quality programs, and not just good programs. I mean quality programs where there are coaches who coach athletes at a high level, Olympians in every single event, and they all converge in this one conference, and it is winner take all. And it amazes me. A couple of years ago, Florida didn't even win their conference. They were like number 5 and still went on to win the national championship because they still had to make pieces. It's like only the SEC. Only the
right.
SEC. I mean,
it is. It's a crazy situation. And, that's kind of how national championships can be from time to time, right? I mean, as long as your cream, the creme of the creme is great, you're going to be able to do well in a national championship meet setting. But also, the SEC is so darn tough that sometimes it's like, well, you might not have the best meet there, but that does not mean that you can't then rally the troops. And you've been through the fire, you've experienced that. So in some respects, the NCAA meet doesn't seem nearly as scary because you're seeing that top flight competition, all the time. And obviously that's the case. The only thing I would say is maybe the SEC, obviously the number 1 woman in the 5,000 meters is from Mizzou and they're in the SEC, but, maybe the distance events aren't nearly as tough in maybe some other places like the Big Ten or the Pac-12 conglomerate conference and indoors. But, but everything else, I mean, there really is no better competition. So
I will not argue with you there. I'm 100% in agreement with you. Well, Ryan, we will discuss again next week. Hopefully, we will review what is expected to be a big weekend. First major competitions for a lot of the big programs. Michigan opens up their brand new facility. I will definitely be on site. I cannot wait. I've been in Ann Arbor, been at their facility before. The last one wasn't bad. It just wasn't great. And the video of this facility, it is a world-class facility, a 200-meter track and a 300-meter track in the same building. How did you even get the money to do that? My God.
Well, it is incredible. And, Michigan, I remember when I was coming up as a track coach and they would win the Big Ten Triple Crown. They go out and win cross-country, indoor, and then outdoor, all in the Big Ten, and that's, I know we've spent a lot of time talking about the SEC, but the Big Ten is a very impressive conference also. And for them to have that facility, and what's really neat about that is that's going to really do some cool things for all college and high school programs in that area. They're going to be able to have a lot of races there and a lot of events there. And, I wish that, nationwide we do a little bit better job of promoting our sport, because it is so flippin' awesome. And there's so many cool things that come out of track and field, and healthy choices and lifelong positive changes you can make from being a track and field athlete. And, recently, I think it was the CEO of Brooks, the company that makes shoes. They're like, running's not a sport. Well, guess what? You go to, first of all, what a dumb thing for the guy to say who's the CEO of, a shoe company. But also, next weekend, when that facility opens up and all those people are flying around, jumping, throwing, sprinting, hurdling, there is no doubt that it is a sport. It is the sport. It is the truest sport. When you were a little kid, what did you do to show you were better than somebody? Hey, race me across the yard. Race me down the street. Race me across the track. So that's the first way you can prove I'm better than you. And I know that sounds crazy, but it is a really neat and empowering thing to be able to challenge yourself and to have something so clearly definitive as a race to make that outcome true. So I'm excited for these performances and really pumped up for track to start again.
I am with you. So fans, let's all take in what Ryan has advised us. It's just weekend one. Let's not be too alarmed, but let's also be cautious of the great performances. But remember, if they're sprinting good now, they're probably going to sprint good later on, just as long as there are no injuries. So here's hoping for another great indoor season. Ryan, thanks again. We'll chat with you soon. And to everyone, thanks again for visiting the Track Nerd. We look forward to speaking with you again next week.
Thanks, guys.
All right.